Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning. I'm sorry I can't be in person. I've really enjoyed my time at the Kennedy School so far. Now more than half of it has been virtual, so I'm looking forward to more of it being in person as we get into next year. What I wanted to do in this talk was to kind of take stock of what we've learned about the economic consequences of immigration for individual countries and for the world as a whole. And the taking stock part is important because we are really at a crossroads when it comes to how countries are approaching immigration. We've, of course, in the last 4 years have had this rise of populist movements that have taken immigration as an organizing principle around which to build support for greater isolationism. And this has been true among political movements on the right and a couple of political movements on the left as well. And now with COVID-19, that the boost for anti-immigration sentiment has really strengthened. And so we quite potentially are looking at a very different immigration landscape as we look forward the next 5 to 10 years. But one of the things I want to highlight today is that that landscape was already changing. And in the United States, it wasn't Donald Trump's election in 2016, which brought that about. We really go all the way back to 2005 when the US became much more intense about beginning to restrict immigration. And so we've already begun the transition, in the US at least, to a lower immigration future. Europe is a little bit behind, but seems to be catching up quite quickly. East Asia was never on board with allowing much in the way of immigration. And so we're staring at an environment in which barriers to cross-border labor flows seems to be ever more intense. So that's kind of the starting point for the talk, is just to recognize that we might be at a high watermark when it comes to immigration in high-income countries. And the amount of labor market immigration that we've achieved through immigration has been impressive, to be sure. Immigrants representing about 15% of the US population, similar numbers in, if slightly lower, among the larger countries in Europe, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain. Higher numbers in a handful of smaller countries, Australia, Canada, Switzerland, and then a high immigration in other countries that have sort of distinct roles in the global economy, in particular in oil states, the Middle East, which have relied heavily on immigrant labor for lower skilled jobs. When we think about immigration's impact on the economy, I think we're at a moment now where we've learned a tremendous amount in the last 10 to 15 years. And so what I'd like to do in the first part of my remarks is just to run through what I think we've learned. And then in part two is to talk about what's happened in terms of immigration policy to add barriers to those flows. And then I want to leave substantial time for discussion so that we can get into these issues in more detail. So when I come to immigration not as a labor economist, I come to immigration as an international economist. And so I think of moving labor from low productivity countries to high productivity countries and generating economic gains that are comparable to what happens when we allow for cross-border movements of goods and services and cross-border flows of capital. Now, just like with trade, immigration isn't going to be an unalloyed good for everyone in receiving or sending countries. It will have distributional impacts. And the complicating impacts of immigration are that because we're talking about the movements of people and people are eligible for social benefit programs, we now have to think about the distributional and efficiency consequences of immigration in a way that's different than we think about them in the context of trade or investment flows. But what we have learned from research to date is that that immigration does move labor from low productivity to high productivity countries. Within countries, to use George Borjas's term, immigration helps grease the wheels of the labor market by moving labor from high to low unemployment regions. It helps concentrate highly skilled labor in clusters of immigration, helping more fully realize agglomeration economies. And kind of a feature of immigration that political scientists focus on more than economists, but I think is very important for thinking about the global welfare consequences of international migration. It helps remove people from exposure to famine, pestilence, and war. So what we know from recent theoretical work, very nice paper by Guerriero et al., which shows that if a government is free to design separate tax policies for the native and the foreign-born, and that's a very big if, then free immigration is optimal. Now, we're not in a world in which those separate tax policies exist, and there are features of the impacts of immigration that we still don't understand very well, in particular, their consequences for domestic political institutions that would leave very much open the question of what would very large-scale immigration do. But I think we can say at the margin, when we think about these kind of 4 bullet points, that we do see evidence of immigration in these dimensions, raising global economic efficiency and welfare, at least on the margin, with the welfare impacts being being an area of impact that works in the other direction, and the dimensions of which I think we only partly understand today. So I'm going to kind of go through quickly. I've picked a paper on each of these dimensions to highlight that gives us a sense of what immigration does for the global economy. So to begin, if we think about moving workers from low productivity to high productivity environments, there's a very nice series of papers by Clemens, Montenegro, and Pritchett that look at the difference in earnings for observationally similar individuals, and they choose individuals who are kind of represent the mode of global migration flows, and those would be youngish men with secondary education who move from a wide variety of countries, and they're focusing on the US as the destination, and then evaluate what's the change in earnings PPP adjusted as a consequence of that move. And what you see is that those gains range from somewhere between about 2 to 8 times the income level by virtue of simply moving from one country to another. Now, the big question here is, well, what about selection? The people who choose to migrate internationally are not random. Could the unobserved characteristics lead us to substantially compress estimates of the income gains? I'm not going to go into kind of the details of their argument. What they argue is that selection impacts appear to be modest. My take is that selection impacts are larger than what they might say, but not nearly large enough to undo real wage increases of 6 to 7 times. So what this tells us is that immigration is in fact moving labor from low productivity to high productivity environments. The fact that substantial wage differences remain tells us that the scale of labor flows and the scale of global trade in goods and services and the scale of investment flows are no way near sufficient to bring us to labor market integration. Now, who benefits, if we think about from the sending country perspective, who benefits from those from that flow of labor? It's the largest gains go to the migrants themselves, because they're the ones who get to put that 3 to 7 time increase in income into their pockets. But we know for many sending countries, those migrants share a substantial portion of their income with family members at home. And so here, what I've done is to pick out countries in which remittances are a substantial share of GDP in the last 2 decades. And I've excluded very small countries, because there are a bunch of very small countries where remittances is a very, very big deal. So this is countries with more than 2 million people, and for which immigration, the remittances from immigration average 5% of GDP over over the last 2 decades. And so what we see is that there are countries in Central America and El Salvador and Honduras where you're seeing remittances being the equivalent of 20% of GDP, and in a handful of other countries, it's even larger. So there are several dozen medium-sized countries for which the export of labor and the export earnings associated with that labor received in the form of remittances is a substantial part of economic livelihood in those nations. Now, who gets to migrate? I mentioned just a moment ago thinking about selectivity on unobservables, which is a challenge when trying to evaluate differences in earnings for, say, a Mexican male with 9 years of education moving from Mexico to the US. We can calculate the change in magnitudes of earnings, but we aren't performing the experiment of moving of randomly moving individuals themselves. So leaving aside for a moment selection on unobservables, what about selection on observables? For most countries, selection on observables runs strongly in the favor of education. So, and the nature of that selection depends crucially on the type of immigration barriers that are present in the receiving country. So here I've picked on the case of India, taking this table from a recent paper by Michael Clemens, in which we're looking at the distribution of education across workers in India. That's the top figure. Then the distribution of education of Indians who've migrated to the United Arab Emirates. That's the middle figure. And then the distribution of education for Indians who've migrated to the US, and that's the bottom figure. And what you see is that wherever Indians appear to be going, they're strongly positively selected on immigration. But the nature of that selection differs strongly between the UAE, which has favored temporary labor contracts for lower skilled workers, and the United States, which reserves non-family based immigration primarily for individuals who can qualify for an H-1B visa and then get access to a green card by virtue of finding an employer who's willing to sponsor them. So this pattern of positive selection on education holds up for almost every bilateral pair of migration flows that we can find globally. I say almost because there are a number of important exceptions. Where migration costs appear to be relatively low, such as between Mexico and the US, or between Turkey and Germany, and now increasingly between Central America and the US. In those contexts, what we find is that the distribution of education across immigrants and the distribution of education across individuals who stay at home look quite similar. Other data bears this out. For those countries where migration costs look pretty low, either because of proximity or because family-based immigration makes it possible for large flows to happen, what immigration looks like to a first approximation is a random draw on the population. Now, what happens once immigrants get inside countries? A very nice paper in the Brookings paper on economic activity by George Borjas, now 15 years or so ago, hypothesized that because immigrants are relatively footloose, they're going to be more responsive to differences in local labor market conditions across regions within a country. Recent work by Brian Cadena and Brian Kovac document this very nicely in the case of low-skilled immigrants in the United States. We know now, going back to the work of John Bound and Harry Holzer, and then a lot of work that's come since, is that for your typical low-skilled worker, we see very little responsiveness of labor supply to adverse changes in labor demand. When we look at immigrants, though, the situation looks quite different. Whereas low-skilled native-born workers aren't that geographically mobile in response to labor market shocks, low-skilled immigrant workers are. So that footloose dimension of being relatively recent arrivals and perhaps having economic motivations rather than family considerations driving where they live allows immigrants to play a role in adjusting to regional differences in shocks within countries. So that's kind of the first two things here on the low-skilled side. Now, when we come to the high-skilled side, the first thing we need to put on the table here is that when we think about low-skilled immigration, it's not clear to me we need to think about kind of the particular industries that low-skilled workers are integrating themselves into. And if you use just kind of off-the-shelf models of trade or off-the-shelf macro models, we're going to do okay as long as we recognize the difference between tradable and non-tradable activities. The same is not true for high-skilled workers. High-skilled immigrants overwhelmingly concentrate in industries that look like they are subject to quite strong agglomeration economies. And so what this means is that in the presence of such non-convexities, the spatial misallocation of labor can be more extreme, and so immigration can have much more important impacts, not just on increasing global productivity as a whole, but potentially increasing dynamic efficiency as well. So just to highlight the importance of spatial concentration, I've taken one table from a recent paper by Enrico Moretti, which shows the concentration of those who patent in the area of computer science. You find this not just in computer science, you find this in a bunch of kind of high-tech sectors. And what we see is if you take the 5 largest cities in the United States, they account for a strong majority of the patenting that goes on in the country. When we look globally and you look at where inventors choose to go, the US has been a strong beneficiary of global migration of those who are interested in patenting. And that can, and agglomeration economies may be an important consideration here. So what this means is now we've got kind of not just immigration helping address static inefficiency associated with the misallocation of labor according to cross-national variation in labor productivity. We've got the potential for dynamic efficiency gains in terms of enhancing prospects for innovation. If you look in the US, immigrants have become an essential feature in the tech economy. If you look at the share of foreign-born workers in STEM occupations, it is substantially higher than the share of foreign-born workers in the US labor force as a whole. That share is about 18%. If you look at STEM occupations with an advanced degree, foreign-born workers are around 45% of hours worked in those activities. And then when we focus in particular on computer occupations, that's closer to 50%. When we then narrow in, so that's the right figure I'm showing you there. When we narrow in on select occupations within STEM, what we see is there are certain areas like software developers and electrical engineers where the presence of the foreign-born, and in particular among those with advanced degrees, is well over 50%. So what this means is that the innovation ecosystem in the United States has become heavily reliant on imported talent. And universities play an important role in terms of how that talent arrives in the US. Many of the workers who ultimately get H-1B visas and go on to get green cards first arrive as students. And here what we're seeing is data from Open Doors, which show the number of students in higher education from India and China. And what we see is in the last decade, just a substantial increases in the presence of foreign students just from these two countries in US higher education. These workers, these students then, by virtue of having been trained in the United States, are kind of at the front of the queue to get jobs in US tech, and in work by Kerr and Kerr, where what they have done is to go in and look. We don't know the nationality of individuals who patent in the United States, but what we can do is, by virtue of individuals' names, draw inferences on their ethnicity. And what they do is show that Indian and Chinese innovators in terms of who patents have grown substantially over time. So now this is when we're going to come kind of the closing of the remarks. I'm just foreshadowing that here. One of the things that COVID-19 might very much do is bring a halt to increases in inflows of foreign students. And we see that the increase was already flattening a couple years before COVID-19 happens. But if we disrupt that flow of foreign students into the US, we are disrupting what is in effect the farm system for high-tech workers. So you think about, you want to draw an analogy either to US baseball or to German soccer. How do you develop talent in those sports leagues? You bring in people when they're young, you have them compete fiercely in engineering programs at US universities, and then you find those who rise to the top and you hire them in to big technology companies. We're now putting that existing system at risk, and with the resilience of that system to having to think about new ways of recruiting workers is very much in question. Now, I want to acknowledge that the belief in the positive dynamic effects of immigration on the U.S. economy or on the global economy is not a universally held belief. George Borjas, in a recent paper, calls into question the relationship between immigration and growth, saying that at least in the macro data, what we see is that growth rates have not risen during periods where immigration has been higher. So I would say that in the literature, what we have are intriguing examples of immigration playing a role in enhancing innovation capacity. At the same time, we need to recognize that overall innovation has been disappointing in many high-income countries for the past couple of decades. And so it's not as though immigration has resolved the challenges of secular stagnation, if that's in fact the predicament in which we find ourselves. Finally, when it comes to the benefits of immigration, I want to highlight a feature which receives a bit less attention in economic research, and that's what immigration does to help remove people from environments where they face threats to their physical well-being. So here, what I'm showing you and this is from a recent paper by Michael Clemens, is showing you parts of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, where the red areas indicate where homicide rates have been higher. These are three of the countries with the highest homicide rates in the world, and the highest rates of death by violent causes of any country not at war. And then what we see here in the bottom graph is where are young people leaving these countries, and they are disproportionately leaving areas that have been violent. Now, they're leaving in an attempt to get into the United States. So this isn't the number of folks who succeed in getting into the US, it's the folks who show up at the border. The large majority of those individuals are being turned away. When we look at the OECD overall, what we see is that during periods of civil conflict, we see substantial increases in applications for asylum. In the EU context, we see this most recently during the peak of the Syrian civil war, where applications for asylum were over 1.6 million. When you look at the actual number of refugees settled in OECD countries, it's less than a tenth of that figure. So there is pressure on the international migration system to help remove people from environments where they face risks to their physical well-being. The immigration system itself is doing a distinctly mediocre job in helping in that removal process. So finally, on the economic impacts, I want to highlight what what immigration means for native-born workers in the United States. And this is taken from a forthcoming Econometrica paper that I wrote with Ariel Burstein, John Vogel, and Lin Tian. And what we do here is to look across regions in the United States, and we distinguish and we recognize the fact that immigrants from particular countries have a tendency to concentrate in particular lines of work, in particular occupations. So you can think of this as revealed comparative advantage, which is remarkably stable over time and has several potential origins. And immigrants tend to concentrate in particular parts of receiving countries in a manner consistent with migration networks that Kaivan Munshi and David Card have noted in their research. We exploit those features to then look at what are the local labor market consequences of immigration, where we distinguish between tradable activities, whereas immigrants come in, you're able to expand production and thereby not put, by exporting more of your output to other areas and thereby not putting downward pressure on local wages, versus non-tradable activities where the arrival of immigrants, that production needs to be absorbed locally, and then you do see downward pressure on immigrants. We embed this in a trade model which allows for differentiated products and a love of variety. And so as you increase the size of regional economies, and in particular, if you're bringing in individuals whose comparative advantage in occupations is distinct, what you're going to be doing is expanding the variety of goods that are available, thereby reducing the price index and enhancing real earnings. So we've got two things going on. We've got three things going on. We've got immigrants putting downward pressure on wages of native workers in occupations in which those native workers also work, with that pressure being stronger in non-tradable than in tradable activities. We have immigrants complementing native workers whose skills whose occupational profile is distinct, and we have immigrants benefiting native workers through gains in product variety. When you put all that together in a structural model and you look across US regions, what you find is that in most places for workers in most occupations, native-born workers gain on net from immigration. Now that rests very heavily on the underlying CES preferences through which workers enjoy utility gains associated with expanded variety. Workers in occupations, in particular non-traded occupations that are immigrant intensive, they're going to see losses from immigration, but workers in most other occupations are going to see gains. So in closing, I'm going to spend just kind of 5 minutes running through what's happening to barriers. Before doing so, I just want to highlight just the very powerful demographic forces working in favor of increased migration flows as we look forward decades hence. And this is much more distinct in the European context, where being relatively close to sub-Saharan Africa, we have one region, Europe, in which its working age population seems set to decline pretty steadily over the coming decades, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, we have one of the few regions in the world where we're going to see still robust population growth. And so that pressure for migration is very much there. Should highlight work that I did with Craig McIntosh and Chen Liu shows that in the US context, that those demographic pressures for migration from Latin America to the US have almost entirely evaporated. So very different situation of the US versus Europe. Okay, so I kind of set the table with showing the different ways in which immigration can enhance efficiency and enhance well-being with, how we aggregate this up. There still is and get global wealth, get national and global welfare impacts. I don't want to suggest there's a consensus view on this at all. Just want to highlight that we've learned a lot about these margins through which immigration can enhance global efficiency and welfare. And now I want to just say just a couple words about what's happened in terms of immigration policy. It remains the case in OECD countries that most immigration is family-based. That is, even if the anchor for the immigrants who arrive might be more refugee-based as it is in the US, or might be more partly skills-based as it is in places like Australia and Canada, the fact that family members are permitted to migrate with individuals who obtain access to whatever is the anchor category of visa, they end up accounting for close to half of immigrant inflows in many contexts. I'm sorry, that's a little bit of an overestimate. Across the OECD, that number is about 41%. But what's happened in terms of immigration barriers? So for the US, what we know is that with H-1B visas, so this is the primary mode of entry for higher skilled workers, you can think of H-1B visas as the queue for getting a green card and being able to stay permanently. H-1B visas have been capped at 70,000, despite a brief increase around 20 years ago. And these days, the supply of H-1B visas runs out within the first few days of them being made available for the coming year. So we have what appear to be strongly binding quotas on skilled immigration in the US. In the European context, you allow skilled immigration from other EU countries. Skilled immigration from outside is much more restricted through national immigration policies, which vary quite widely across countries. When it comes to unauthorized immigration in Europe, that unauthorized immigration accounts for about 20% of the foreign-born population. It appeared to have peaked in 2016, right around the height of the Syrian civil war, and has come down modestly since. And so that range, we've got somewhere between 4 and 5 million unauthorized immigrants in the EU. What we have in the US is around 10 million unauthorized immigrants. That number also peaked, but peaked a decade earlier than it did in Europe. It peaked in 2006, right before the Great Recession and housing bust diminished demand for immigrants. But that wasn't the only part of the story. What also happened was a concerted increase in the US to raise barriers to the flows of low-skilled workers. And that has taken a number of different forms. Quite the simplest form it's taken is a more than quadrupling of the Border Patrol officers who are there to impede migration across physical migration across borders. So think of this as just Border Patrol agents at the US-Mexico border. It's also taken the form of a border fence, which runs along about 700 miles of the US-Mexico border. So Donald Trump very famously has wanted to build a wall. Kind of the a less appreciated fact is that President Bush built a fence. President Obama kept that fence in place. Both presidents were intent on maintaining substantially increased enforcement in the US interior. For many decades, the US had an implicit social contract with unauthorized immigrants. If you can make it across the border and you stay out of trouble and you work, then you're going to be allowed to stay. And that led the population of unauthorized immigrants in the US to reach a third of the foreign-born population and about 6% of the US labor force. That implicit contract was broken in 2005 by President Bush, who gambled on trying to pass comprehensive immigration reform, which would have legalized undocumented immigrants in the country and expanded opportunities for high-skilled immigration. He struck a bargain with conservative Republicans in which he was going to get tough on unauthorized immigration, and in return, they were going to provide political support for comprehensive immigration reform. It didn't work. What did happen, though, is that the increased interior enforcement that President Bush put in place was sustained by President Obama, and not surprisingly, has been sustained by President Trump. And so we now find ourselves in an environment where barriers at the border to inflows are now much more substantial than they were 15 years ago. And so we have strongly binding limits as well. So looking forward, before COVID-19, where did this opposition to immigration come from? And I'm going to just flag these quickly, and we can perhaps talk about them more in more depth during the Q&A. You have concerns over fiscal impacts of immigration, especially the low skilled. Oh my goodness, I have a typo for George Borjas here. Very sorry. That George's work has shown very nicely. We have work by Alsina and La Ferrara, which shows that immigration, by virtue of increasing racial and ethnic diversity, can weaken support for the provision of public goods. We have work by Colantoni and Stanig, which shows that immigration plays into ploys by nationalist politicians in order to increase support for isolationist policies. And then we have literature by political scientists who say, look, opposition to immigration, it's not about economics, it's about culture. And what we have is a political and cultural conflict between globalists and populists that's been simmering over time. And I've got a couple nice graphs here from recent papers by Alsina, Miano, and Stancheva, which I'm happy to show if folks are interested. But to close, so where does this bring us now with COVID-19? Well, we'd seen rising populist sentiment against immigration over the past decade. COVID-19 will only strengthen those political forces and heighten the tension that we see between globalists and multiculturalists on one side and populists and nationalists on the other side. With social distancing measures and travel bans, we literally have everyone in favor in at least a temporary moratorium on immigration, with there going to be pressure to keep immigration much lower in the future than it has been in the past. Added to that, with higher unemployment, we're going to see and increased spending for social insurance schemes. We're going to see substantial strains on government budgets, which will, if past experience serves, likely further erode support for low-skilled immigration. This has easily forecastable economic consequences in terms of the provision of labor-intensive goods and non-traded services in OECD countries, and also diminished comparative advantage for certain labor-intensive industries that have been able to hold on in high-income countries despite the way the more tech orientation that those countries have adopted. And what this means, more for the US than for anyone else, because the US has kind of remained kind of the global technology leader. We're disrupting those inflows of international students. We are throwing a wrench into the innovation ecosystem in the United States, with tech industries having to figure out how they're gonna accommodate. So with that, I'll end kind of formal remarks and open to questions.
Thank you, Gordon. This was remarkable and extremely timely talk. So we're very fortunate to have you here. There are a few questions that have been posted on the chat. I am not sure if you're able to see them. I can read them for you.
Yeah, here we go.
So one is asking, are the causes of the three countries' migration similar? I think this was, Jaime, can you remind us which part you were referring to? Oh, all right.
Oh, yes, thank you. There was a drill in my apartment, so sorry if I just mute myself again. So I was just asking when you showed the Northern Triangle, making a case that also violence was like a trigger that is causing people to migrate. Though I believe there's enough evidence to try to associate this. I believe there are many other reasons, including obviously economic and weather related. So I just wanted to see your views, because this type of immigration is different than the one that you were showing before, that is more related with high tech and innovation. So just wanted to see how you see this region.
Yeah, so the Northern Triangle of Central America embodies kind of some of the folk wisdom we've accumulated about immigration, which is just kind of partially represented in economic models, and it captures the idea that that it's hard to get people to move. We have enormous income differences across countries, but in normal economic times, what we typically see are relatively small flows. What engenders large flows are precipitating events. That can be something like the tequila crisis in Mexico, which led to substantial outflows of workers in 1995, in 1996, as did financial crises which occurred in Mexico in the 1980s. In the Central American context, we've had migration from Central America to the US for decades. It has peaked during the dramatic increase in physical insecurity in those countries as a result of drug gangs coming to control substantial portions of national territory. It can be war or famine or pestilence or other triggers that help start migration flows. And then you can think of it as following something like a diffusion process. There's sufficiently poor information about prospects in destination countries where flows aren't already established, that absent a trigger, you're unlikely to see substantial flows occur. But once they get started, they can continue, and they can even accelerate even as wage differences between regions decline. And that feature of the migration process as being something like a diffusion process, it's a very nice paper by Carrington and Dr. Garsh on the Great Migration from the South to the North of African Americans in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s.
There is a second question by Frank Nefke. He says that there is an increasing body of case studies showing the positive effect of return migration on new industries showing up in the home countries where return migrants are going back to. He's asking whether you are aware of more global evidence for that, and in general, like, what is your sense about the impact of return migration on the development of the home countries?
So maybe I can add to the question. Sorry, this Frank. We looked ourselves at the Mexicans returning from the US, finding mixed evidence. So there is some people in Mexico benefit from that, some actually lose in terms of their wage. Employment seems to be increasing regardless of what's happening. But the Mexican returnees are, as you mentioned, not positively selected. So it's not a high skill group that went to the US and got trained in US universities, US companies, and then returned home. So countries like China and Taiwan are actually putting a lot of resources in getting people educated in the US in the hope that they would return with this knowledge. So I'm not sure if there's any sense of how important that channel is in a global sense.
Yeah. So I think there's been a bias. There is a active and very insightful literature on return migration, to be sure. I think there's long been a sense that whatever the motivations for migrants going abroad are, and the sense that their intent is to return, that in a large majority of cases, in fact, they become permanent. This was some of the earliest work on this. There's this great book by Michael Piori called Birds of Passage, which talked about the process through which immigrants began by conceiving of themselves as having an instrumental purpose to migration, in which they're going to go earn a certain amount of money to come back so that they can build a restaurant, buy a taxi, launch a small business, help build a new home. They have a particular goal in mind, but by virtue of their experiences in the destination country, transition to becoming permanent. I think so there was kind of a bias that, well, immigration at the end of the day, and then there's the adage that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary migrant, that whatever the flows are, they ultimately solidify themselves. I think in the current environment, we're appreciating now that that's less and less true. That's in part because if you think about flows of migrants to the Middle East, by contract, many of those flows are impermanent. In the United States, because of the breaking of this implicit contract with undocumented immigrants, we're now seeing much more substantial return flows than people would have anticipated 10 years ago. And it's now opening the landscape for understanding what return migration means. So migrants are bringing back experiences, and they're bringing back human and physical capital. The type of experiences and the type of human and physical capital are going to vary enormously, and also quite systematically, with the forces that engendered their initial migration in the first place. So in the Mexican context, as you mentioned, you're talking about individuals who what they're returning primarily with are not necessarily skills that are going to be valuable in their local labor market context in Mexico. They're going to come back with physical capital that allows them to enjoy a higher standard of living via small business, via a better home, or what have you. In the Taiwanese case, it's quite different, because the avenue for entry of those individuals into the US was through higher education. They are almost by design going to then be bringing back human capital that does have value in a Taiwanese context, which has a strong comparative advantage in electronics and tech-oriented activities. So the consequences of return migration are going to vary enormously across bilateral contexts. And now, one of the consequences of the fact that immigration is facing greater barriers and there's more pressure pushing people back home, we're going to have the opportunity to understand those differences much more richly.
There is a question by Matthew Fisher-Post. Again, I'm not sure if you're able to see it. If you're not, I'll read it. The ideological opposition to immigration is often justified by pointing to economic losses to domestic workers or citizens. How do the total economy magnitudes of these losses compare to the size of the losses for free movement of capital and goods and services? And how do the size of the domestic gains from migration compare to the size of the domestic gains from trade / capital flows?
Yeah, I think we have a better answer to the first question than to the second question, but I don't think we have good answers to either. When it comes to assessing the global welfare consequences of trade, the literature has become comfortable with using now what's become the canonical model, and that model has an underlying gravity structure. It's consistent with micro foundations that come from Paul Krugman or John Eaton and Sam Cordum or Mark Mellitz. You can even have kind of Armington micro foundations. But we've got a wide range of motivations for why countries trade that give us similar predictions for the magnitudes of those trade flows, and qualitatively similar predictions for the magnitude of the gains from trade, with the primary differences across models in terms of being this key elasticity of trade to trade costs, with where that elasticity comes from varying across models, but the importance of that elasticity for welfare impacts being common across models. and what that literature has told us is that if you impose kind of a single elasticity across all traded goods, welfare gains look quite small. That's because the average elasticity the average elasticity is pretty low. When you then allow for variation in that elasticity across goods, you get substantially larger welfare gains. So we now have a theoretical construct that we're comfortable with, at least in using to say something about welfare impacts. We don't have something comparable in the migration context. And that's, I think, in large part because I don't think we've come to terms with assessing the fiscal impacts of immigration in any individual country, let alone across all countries, because those fiscal impacts are complicated, because those fiscal impacts are inherently dynamic. You have to think about future generations, and because the nature of social welfare schemes differ so much across countries. That said, though, I would conjecture that it doesn't matter that the fiscal part is not gonna be first order. If you look at the magnitude of the income gains that international migrants get from moving from home country to destination country, they are so big that it's not conceivable to me that the welfare losses from greater distortions via increased use of social insurance schemes is going to be enough to counteract them. Now, it might be enough to lead to welfare losses among a larger fraction of citizens in receiving countries. So when you think of it in terms of the global distribution of gains from migration, the challenge in all of this in terms of the political economy is that the large majority of those gains go to the migrants themselves. And they end up being individuals who don't really vote in the sending country because they've left, and they don't vote, at least not immediately, in the receiving country because they arrive as non-citizens. And that means that we have a key constituency in favor of global migration that lacks political voice in terms of how these decisions are made. It also highlights the fact that however unjust it might seem, there's substantial income gains on the table that, if they were redistributed, could engender stronger domestic support for migration in receiving countries. So that was a long way of saying we don't really know, but I would kind of highlight that we do have a sense of kind of the rough magnitudes of which groups gain the most, with the migrants being at the top of the list.
Thank you.
I'm going to read the next two questions. First says, considering the fact that a lot of high and low skilled migrants contribute to Social Security in the United States, do you think reduction in immigration might be somewhat counterproductive in the long run? And the second question is asking you to talk more about the illegal drug flows across the borders and the feedback loops.
So on the fiscal contributions of immigrants in the U.S., it's really important to highlight that the way in which immigrants interact with the fiscal system varies enormously according to the nature of fiscal decentralization. In the US, one of the big challenges we have is that a decent share of the tax revenues that come from lower skilled immigrants, ignore higher skilled immigrants because they're on net likely to be net fiscal contributors. And so, are providing net transfers to the native-born population. So focusing just on the low skilled, they pay taxes via Social Security, and the undocumented, because they have to have a Social Security card, are paying taxes into a system from which they will receive no benefits. They're also going to pay property taxes and sales taxes. Many of them who want to create a paper trail that will provide that helps them get home loans and car loans, a little less true today than it was 10 years ago, will voluntarily pay income taxes. Big chunk of those tax revenues are going to the federal government. Now, who's on the hook for the fiscal cost imposed by low-skilled immigrants? The biggest single category by far is public education. So it's K-12 education, and that is states and localities. So we have this environment in which the federal government is getting a disproportionate share of the benefits and is absorbing a lower share of the costs, and states and localities are receiving less in terms of the fiscal revenues and are bearing much more in terms of the fiscal burden. And that creates this tension between national and local level governments in terms of how we resolve the fiscal environment. So that means that even if we're pulling illegal immigrants out, it's not for states and localities. They aren't going to feel a reduction in tax revenues in the same way that the federal government will. They will perceive a reduction in terms of social expenditure. Now, I think more important than that, those low-skilled immigrants are an anchor for certain export industries in smaller communities in the United States. So you think of things like meat packing. You think of things like the textile and apparel production that remains in the U.S. Southeast. Absent low-skilled immigrants, those industries are likely, if not gone, substantially diminished. As export industries, once you take away the mobile resource that is essential to retaining a local comparative advantage, those places become much less viable. And so I would say that the primary impacts come not the direct impacts on fiscal accounts, but the indirect impacts on fiscal accounts by lowering overall export production in those locations. On the feedback loops from violence, I'm not sure. I might need a little help in terms of understanding the nature of that question.
I can read the rest of it.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please do.
Okay, so the question is, as a former Southern Californian, you have a substantial number of migrants flowing across the border into the United States as part of a larger international illegal drug industry. Many of them are arrested and imprisoned, but in the past 20 years, the U.S. prison system and the U.S. government has taken the position that they will expel those people back to their home countries, in particular Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, where there has been a marked increase in terms of violence and crime that flows from this enormous international goods trade, which is associated with labor migration, that's all within the realm of an under or unreported drug industry. And I wanted your comments on those feedback loops and how to incorporate the costs of social disruption into some of your estimates of benefits.
Yeah, no, this is a very important point, which I think all we can really do right now is acknowledge, and understanding how we incorporate that in on the modeling side, I think is I'm not seeing. I don't think any of the existing models are going to give us much traction there. So we spoke just a moment ago about how via return migration, migrants bring back human or physical capital. When it comes to migrants who engaged in criminality, you had Central Americans who had fled the region because of civil strife in Central America in the 1980s, came to the U.S. Some of the kids got involved in criminal activities, and they were imprisoned. So we put the youth of those migrants in U.S. prisons during the height of the crack boom. And you would think of that as if you wanted the best possible education for how to run street level criminal organizations related to the drug trade, it would have been LA prisons in the 1980s. And then those folks come back with that knowledge to a region that's coming out of civil strife, has tender institutions, is now lacking the same U.S. economic and military support that it had in regions past, and it was easy pickings. It's like exporting NBA players back to El Salvador to play against the national team. They had no hope. And so anecdotally, what we have is that the nature of that flow, migration flow into prison, back to home countries via forced deportation of people who served their sentences, had this unintended consequences of helping build an incredibly powerful, violent, and resilient transnational criminal organization. And none of our models bring that into account. And for Central America, you think about the gains from immigration relative to what, relative to the damage that's been wrought by the rise of these criminal gangs. It's very much an open question. Now, the counterfactual there is tough because you also had regions with very weak domestic institutions and folks kind of ready to upset stuff. But it is one in which I think a case can be made that the openness had some very damaging unintended consequences.
We're actually at the end of the time, and what's coming next is lunch. I'd like to thank Gordon Hanson for an inspiring talk and a very rich conversation afterwards. I'd actually like to ask, because I assume that there are more people who may have questions and would like to hear more from you. If you have a bit of time to stay online for maybe like another 10 minutes, if that's possible. If not, that's fine. Everyone else deserves lunch. You too, no, don't get me wrong, but you're just too important. And so whoever wants to take the lunch break and log off for a while, please do that. We will reconvene at 12:45 sharp Eastern time. But those who want to stick around for another 5 and 10 minutes, for the case Gordon Hanson is available, do that, and we may go back and forth with a few more questions.
Sure, I'm happy to stick around. I just had breakfast, so I don't need a lunch break yet.
I was hoping for that. So actually, I was wondering, you showed us this chart about Europe projected to shrink over time, and Africa having this explosion of population that's being expected. And some European countries, and I'm talking particularly about the Baltic states, are losing their population to other more advanced European economies, and are actually facing a lot of shortages of all kinds of labor, from the low skill to the high skill. And however, they have mainly culture-driven fears of allowing for more immigration. And that's, I wonder how you, what would you tell them in that respect to, I don't know, argue differently? And the second thing is that most of the loss is in rural areas. So most of the population loss is in rural areas. And rural areas are not really suited for migrant labor for various reasons, both cultural but also institutional. And even when they attempt to locate migrants in rural areas, they come there, and as a springboard, they actually then try to go into the cities where the shortages are not that severe. So I wonder, what do you think in those, on those two issues?
Yeah, so, you know, in particular, when you're talking about small countries, the migration flows, even of modest amounts, can have enormous impacts on society, and those impacts are disruptive. You know, when it comes to immigration, we reach out to economic models, which are going to put things in terms of, you know, our standard evaluation of the sources of real income, but we don't have a good sense of how immigration changes the amenities that people associate with living in a particular place, that are tied to culture and tradition and other things which matter, and which are legitimate sources of concern regarding fully open borders. And when immigration really gets going, the impacts are transformative. So think about where I live in, where I grew up in California. In 1848, California becomes part of the United States. There were 7,000 Californios. So these were the residents of California left over from Mexico, having given up California to the U.S. And they had a culture that they had been developed over a couple centuries. 2 years later, the gold rush happens, and a couple 100,000 people move in from all over the world, and culture as they know it was completely changed. So it happens. Now, does that mean then, because you want to avoid that risk of disruption, that you just eliminate labor inflows, you prevent that opportunity from happening? I think, especially in environments where you're able to track migrants pretty well. Many European countries are pretty good about, in terms of documenting who works where and where people live. You can think about controlled flows of temporary workers, and you can try stuff out. And you can start small and you can grow bigger, and you can see how it can be done in a constructive way. And so that you can have that acculturation process happen in a manner that's complementary rather than destructive. Because oftentimes fears about immigration are overblown. In 1748, Benjamin Franklin's primary concern about immigration was that all these Germans were going to Germanize the American colonies before the colonies could anglicize them. And that, the thing about the US is the US is pretty good at turning people into Americans, for better or worse. Now, if you're talking about the Baltic states, it's a different question. But I don't think the question is between total transformation and nothing. The opportunities for availing yourself of some of these gains are certainly on the table.
Great. There is a question from Samuel. It says, regarding return migration, I've had a lot of discussion amongst migrants here in the UK who are considering moving back to their home countries due to a combination of COVID-related reasons and social capital reasons. I was wondering if there is any precedent to understanding how big events like this alter people's individual migration calculations.
We have a lot of them. Now, most of them happen around migration that is inspired by, typically by war. So one of the biggest movements back and forth across the border in US history was the migration of Mexicans that happened during the Mexican Revolution, so in the 1910s, and then during the Cristero Rebellion of the 1920s. And you had a couple million people, million odd people migrate into the US, and then most of them went back. If you think about the flows of individuals in Europe during World War II, we had people who rode out the war in one place and then went home after the fact. Now, in those contexts, the individuals who moved very much had in mind that the move wasn't permanent. They were being forcibly dislodged. I don't know how different that is from migrant flows today, because so many individuals start out with the idea that their migration is going to be temporary. Now, the challenge in learning lessons from those earlier migrations where we've seen substantial movements back to the origin country is that the accounts are primarily historical and case studies. So we don't have a lot of accounts that are going to compare across episodes and draw lessons in a comparative way. But precedent is certainly there.
Thanks.
I actually have another question. Since a lot of the talk here on this workshop is about technology, There is some evidence that shows that if there is substitutability between technology and labor, it tends to be with the low skilled and the medium skilled workers, which often coincide to be migrants in many places. So I think a lot of places are facing a real decision of whether to admit more migrants or whether to automate more. What are your thoughts on this connection, especially as you elaborated in the today's situation of COVID, where even if you want to, you cannot really expand on migration? Will this accelerate automation? What effects do you think we will see?
Yeah, so I really want to highlight the difference between tradable and non-tradable activities here. With non-tradable activities, you're only facing local competition, and so you can you have a captive market in some sense, and so even if automation is expensive, if automation is the only way in which you can provide certain services, you will automate. When we're talking about tradable activities, it's different because now you have to deal with some competitor, and it depends on what the elasticity of export supply of that set of competitors looks like. So if you think about something like the global apparel industry, and you're saying you're a country that, like the United States, where the apparel production that remains in the US disproportionately employs migrant labor, are you going to invest in automation? Well, when you're competing against Bangladesh and Vietnam, the answer is probably no, because you're talking about export supply curves that are pretty flat, and the returns aren't there, and so those activities are simply gone. What this means is that we've got some regions that hung on via immigrant labor that are going to face dramatic changes in their economic livelihood. And this is true in a number of parts of Europe and the United States, where the US and Europe educated itself out of certain labor-intensive activities. And the only way in which production remained in those activities is because low-skilled immigrants arrived to take those jobs. So once you cut off that flow, those sectors are gone, and many of those sectors are located in smaller and medium-sized towns. And when you see your primary export industry go, what we know from studying the China trade shock is that it can be really, really disruptive. So I would worry less about the bigger cities. I would worry more about those manufacturing activities where margins are thin and foreign competition from foreign exports is intense.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions on the chat.
Good. I hope everyone's going and getting lunch. It's very odd to walk away when we eat lunch, but I suppose that's how things work in the Zoom world.
Right. Well, we're glad that we can connect over at least 4 time zones. There are probably many more given by the names and the locations of the people. So thank you so much. This was both inspiring and informative, and thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for including me, and be well.